Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, I am Representative David Levine from the Connecticut General Assembly, and I'm here to moderate tonight on this debate. And before I introduce the two debaters, I would like to tell you how the debate has been organized. Each of the participants will make a 45-minute statement. There will then be a 15-minute rebuttal, followed by a 5-minute summation. Those of you who are in the middle of the aisle, it's too late. We will then have questions. I would ask that you use the mics on either side of the auditorium to ask your question, that the question be no longer than 1 minute, and I will ask the responders to also be similarly brief. They probably will have said everything that they had meant to say, and we can get more questions in at that time. I would ask you to address your questions through me, and I will direct them to the participants. One final word. This is a very large audience. I've been here for some of the movies, and it doesn't get a quarter of this. Consequently, I would ask that we really do not applaud or make any other sign of encouragement or discouragement, because with this many people, it really would make an impossible situation. Thank you, and now I will introduce the two participants. Speaking first is Dr. Earl Hanson of Wesleyan University. Dr. Hanson did his college work at Bowdoin and went on from there to do graduate work in genetics at Indiana University. He received his PhD and did postdoc work at the University of Chicago, and then went to Yale University and on to Wesleyan. He's the author of several books, including The Origin and Early Evolution of Animals and Understanding Evolution. He has been in the College of Science and Society since 1975, which is a cross-disciplinary college, and has now become part of Wesleyan's curricula. Our other participant is Dr. Richard Lumsden. Dr. Lumsden had his undergraduate education at Rice University and his postdoctoral training at the Tulane School of Medicine. He served for 20 years on the faculty of Tulane's College of Art and Science and the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. He has served at Tulane as a professor, a research scientist, and as dean of the graduate school. He has worked with many prestigious organizations and received grants from programs such as the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation, National Research Council, to name several. He is currently professor and chairman of biology at the Institute of Creation Research in San Diego. And with that, I will turn the first 45 minutes to Dr. Hanson.
Thank you. And I hope you recognize and enjoy the fluency with which David introduced all of us. He was obviously staying very close to his script, but he got it all right, at least in my part. And okay for you too? All right. Thank you very much, David. All right, we're underway. My ambitious aim here is to show that creation science is not science, and therefore is not a scientific explanation for the diversity of living things. And conversely, I will be showing you why indeed we must consider evolutionary science to be effective science and an explanation for diversity. Now, I'm going to have the problem of running back and forth, and when I leave this mic, if I'm not speaking loud enough, please speak up. The proposition for this debate was one that, when I first saw it, dismayed me. There was just too much that we were trying to cover. And I want to show you that, and then come to what we're saying. Now, if you want with me, can you read that? If not, I'll read it at the top. I was first given as a proposition by the Institution for Creation Research that we would debate the issue that the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origin. And when I got on the phone, it turned out the mention of origins meant origin of the cosmos, origin of galaxies, origin of stars, origin of planetary systems, origin of life, etc. And I said, but look, Darwin said nothing about any of those. He was trying to explain the diversity of living things. Could we not restate it so that the theory of evolution through natural selection is superior to the theory of special creation as a scientific explanation for the evidence related to the origins of biological diversity? And I told him that would make a little debate. Richard Lumsden came forward as the person who was to be the debater, and I received a very gracious letter from him agreeing to this restatement. So we will be discussing this lower issue, where it has been narrowed to trying to understand the diversity of living things. And then I want to add one more thing here. In the letter to me of September 1st, Professor Lumsden went on to say, where debates are concerned, especially on a university campus, I'm more interested in an educationally productive exchange of ideas, not a contest of the protagonist's wit and rhetoric. Thus, I eschew panels of judges tabulating scores, taking audience votes, etc., to determine a winner. And I could only thank him for that. As some of you may know, and as many of my colleagues warned me, watch out for these creationists. They're tricky. They will do all kinds of things to lure you into debates where you don't have a chance. And when I heard this, I mentioned this to some of my colleagues, and they said, watch out, those creationists are tricky. Having met him at the airplane and having had supper with him, well, I'll stop there. You'll see how tricky he is. Let me turn to the substance then, which is Darwin's theory. What exactly did Darwin say? Oh, this will help. In the Origin of Species, okay? In the Origin of Species, Darwin had these 5 points. He observed species have the potential for over-reproduction. Secondly, he observed species populations remain constant. And when you put those together, you can produce lots of offspring. Think of a maple tree and all the seeds that come showering down, and all thousands of seeds each year from one original seed, and that goes on year after year after year. Think of codfish. A female codfish at one spawning can lay 56 million eggs. It's there. Tremendous ability for over-reproduction. Perhaps our own species is the obvious exception to that, but the vast majority of the others remain there. Between the two of them, there is a struggle for survival. Many more are born than persist. And then another observation, heritable variations occur. Now, if you put heritable variations occurring in the context of a struggle for survival, what happens is natural selection. Those heritable variations of significance to survival will be selected. You can see here there's nothing about the origin of the universe, galaxies, stars, solar systems, nor even of life itself. Darwin started from the notion that, yes, living things are here. Can we account for the variety that we see? if we try and answer that question, we run up immediately against a problem that Darwin was somewhat aware of. He really didn't have the foggiest notion how heritable variations occur. He was a contemporary of Mendel, but he never read Mendel's paper. 18 years after Darwin died, Mendel's paper was rediscovered in 1900. Darwin died in 1882. And there started our understanding of heritable variations. And we now have really the addition that comes from that, the inheritance of genetic information in populations. We refer to them shorthand as Mendelian populations. And what have we learned from that? We have learned really that the essence of this whole selection process is that those organisms that survive because they've got hereditary characteristics that improve their survival, their adaptability. That being so, those genes are passed on. And there is then a slight but continuing change in their genetic structure. Now, this variation within species, as we call it, is not a point of debate between myself and Professor Lumsden. The creationists accept the reality that within the different created kinds, evolutionists say within the different species, there is this genetic variation. We're agreed there. But why it is not trivial from the evolutionary point of view is that this is the whole basis of added change, accumulated change, eventually resulting in sufficient difference between populations that they can no longer exchange genetic information, and they become reproductively isolated, and you go from the microevolution, variation within a population, to two separate populations that are now on their way for further divergence. But any good theory, any scientific theory has to be tested. It isn't enough just to propose it. And we really were not able to test natural selection until we had these ideas of Mendelian inheritance. And I'm only going to cite two examples where the testing has been done. One very simple thing was done in our laboratory for cosmic and biological evolution. We started with a population, literally millions of bacteria in a small test tube. That's a population. And then we plated these bacteria in the presence of a drug that normally kills them, will kill all the ones sensitive to the drug. And then we tested those that survived, and we found that they were resistant. And not only that, we found that that resistance was passed on through culturing these, and when we tested them again, lo and behold, essentially the whole population was now resistant. Now, what was observed there was a population that was almost entirely sensitive. After being selected by the presence of the antibiotic, they became essentially entirely resistant. Now, right here, I'm going to be a little bit heretical. I am not one of those biologists who will argue that evolution is a fact. Evolution is a theory. And by evolution, I am, of course, referring that shorthand to evolution through natural selection. Now, what's this theory in fact bit? Stephen Jay Gould is one who does say evolution is a fact, and he says you can see it. You can see it in the change in gene frequencies in a population. I'm going to be nitpicking. We saw a population that was sensitive, and when exposed to the drug, only few survived. Now that you can see, just a few colonies instead of millions of colonies when we had every reason to think there were millions of cells there. You saw the ones that survived. Then you grew them up. You didn't see any genes changing in there. But what you saw then later on was when you tested them again, that many cells survived. You saw these two events here. Those are the facts. And you interpreted them with the theoretical structure of natural selection. My point is you don't see these processes. You don't see the idea of selection, but you see their consequences. You can test the ideas, and that's going to be crucial in my argument with Professor Lumsden. I am at loss as to how the creationists come up with really rigorous, solid tests. And in the absence of such tests, I would argue there is the absence of science. Now, that example I gave you is from populations, laboratory populations. I can give you another example, and this comes from organisms that we find in nature. And I hope this will project well enough. Let me start with that image up there and that image there. Those represent two moths. The one in your upper right is the so-called wild type. And normally, when that sits on a lichen-covered background that you see here, it's almost impossible. There is one moth right there that is the same as that. This dark one is obviously conspicuous. If you look carefully, right here is a dark one with its legs there and there. And what I'm talking about is that in the industrial parts of England, downwind from the factories, coal deposited the pollution of soot all through the woodlands. And Kettlewell and his students noticed that indeed, in these areas that were polluted, the frequency of these light forms was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the frequency of these was getting larger and larger. Where there was no pollution, the light-colored forms were still predominant, and the dark were not. And there's a single gene difference between these. These have a large dominant gene, and these are pure for a recessive gene. What you're seeing here in the context of the selection, and the selection was visual predation by birds. During the day, you could see, and they took photographic evidence of this, movies, that in these areas, these were killed much more frequently, these, and reverse in this other area, these are the ones that were eliminated relative to this. So natural selection was going on here. But again, the creationists may say, that's all well and good. Those are just a few genes shifting around within a natural population or within a given kind. Yes, but point I'm trying to make is that this kind of gene frequency is the basis, ultimately, for genetic separation. But within the laboratory and in nature, you can see, without any trouble, evidence for these changes. If you look at a map of Great Britain, where each circle represents an area of sampling for the Biston betularia, the peppered moth, you realize the prevailing wind is coming from the southwest here, and in the Midlands and beyond it, you can see areas where the whole population is dark. Down here, where there is no pollution, the population is white. This map was made in the late 50s, early 60s. And what we are seeing in these areas where a pollution abatement has now come in, that these are now changing again. And there is a slow and steady rise as pollution is leaving the woods, a return of the light-colored moths. Precisely what we would predict if our evolutionary selectionist theory is correct. Exactly that is happening. I don't know whether the creationists want to bother themselves with this because, yes, indeed, this is within a species. So I have to go beyond the species. But what we're talking about is we can observe certain things, and we do have ideas to make those observations intelligible. We have facts, and we use a theory to explain those facts. Now let me turn beyond the micro level to the macro level. Biologists refer to microevolution, that's variation within a species, and evolution above the species level as macroevolution. I believe the creationist term is horizontal and vertical change. All right. I want to turn next to the whole business of looking at the variety of forms that we have and trying to make sense of them. Here I'm first going to talk about fossil forms. Fossils come in all shapes and sizes. Briefly, they are any evidence of life in the past. Any evidence of life in the past. Classic ones are here of Archaeopteryx. This is what was found. Only 6 such specimens have been found. We've got a very good copy in our own museum up on the 4th floor here. And reconstructing from that, we realized here is a form that has reptile-like teeth, even though it has feathers. It has claws on its wings that are vestiges of the reptilian ancestry. But you can also get fossil leaves here. These can be looked at in great detail, even down to the cellular structure. You can get fishes, essentially with all their bones intact, and then something that is not caught in rock. There is occasionally a frozen mammoth. This was pulled out of the Arctic tundra. Its trunk was sewed back on there, and we get this kind of form also as evidence of life in the past. But think a moment about the whole process of fossilization. There is no good evidence as to how complete the fossil record is. One rough, very rough guess is that perhaps 1% of the forms that have ever lived have been turned into fossils. And the reason for this is quite straightforward. To become a fossil in the sense of the Archaeopteryx or the fish or the leaf, you have to be lying in a calm sediment, and other sediments have to come on top of that. That all has to remain undisturbed. As the sediments build up, that finally has to harden into rock, and then sometime later, a human being has to find it. You realize that most organisms don't die conveniently in shallow water. There are all kinds of organisms dying out in deserts, on grassy plains, in forests, in woodlands, and hills, and our fossil record is really limited to those that manage to die. That's really not quite the way to put it. In the muds that will sediment and turn into rock. And as I say, maybe only 1%, and that's probably optimistic, of those that ever lived have ended up as fossils. And then, given the fossilization, there is, of course, movement of sediment, grinding of rocks, folding of rocks, erosion. Humans are not always there that when the erosion has laid bare a fossil, they find it. Many are lost. Again, roughly what? 1% of the fossils that have been formed are available to human inspection. So altogether, what, 1/10,000th? Well, the long and the short of that is that we have every reason to predict that the fossil record will be incomplete. And here again, I can turn to the creationists who have made, understandably, a very major point of this. They say if indeed all forms have been created at one time, the separate creations will result in gaps between them. Their explanation of gaps is therefore a consequence of their idea of creation. The evolutionist sense of gaps comes from the very incompleteness of the fossil record. We don't know how incomplete, nor can the creationists tell us why indeed they should have been created with any gaps at all. Why couldn't they have been created with hardly any difference between them? Why couldn't they have been created with 2 gaps or 3 gaps? One of the problems here is the very imprecision of the forces or the process, whatever it was, that led to creation. It is so vaguely formulated that it's almost impossible to have precise predictions from it. With the process of fossilization known to have occurred in the sense that I'm speaking from an evolutionary point of view, we again cannot predict the size. The long and the short of it is, if gaps are any sort of a prediction, both the evolutionists and the creationists say there are going to be gaps. And nothing there really supports us one way or the other. But, despite the incompleteness of the fossil record, one estimate is there's something like 130 million fossils available in the collections around the world. A lot have shown up. What do we do with that? One of the classic examples is, of course, the story of the evolution of the horse. On the left-hand side here is a series of skulls going back to the Paleocene. This is the end of the Mesozoic. This is about 90 million years ago. And you see coming up, very diagrammatically presented by strata here, we have found different skulls. And you see then that this skull has an appearance smaller, shorter, the eyes in the middle. That changes as you go up, the snout gets longer. Other things change. Look at the teeth. With a small premolar here, another premolar, then getting larger molars, we find as we go along there is a change apparent. Change apparent. I slipped in a theoretical explanation. The observation is these are different. But what you see up here is maybe one premolar and all the rest molars. So there is a sequence here where we see these differences. And we also see in terms of the way the teeth are formed, they're small here with short crowns. As you get up here, they're large crowns. We have every reason to infer from that that these were browsers, that they nibbled on the bushes, some grass around there. Then as they invaded the grasslands, the grinding of the grasses with the silicates necessitated, through natural selection, a tougher, longer, higher crown in the teeth, and we see that emerging. If you come out in the grasslands, you probably have to run. You can't scurry around in the bushes to evade the predators. And you see a change from four-toed front leg to three-toed to one-toed with what's left of the two toes here. And then unfortunately, I don't know why, this was turned upside down. Actually, that's the toe there, the bone that lies inside the hoof. But there is a single toe, 4 to 1. In the hind leg, it's gone from 3 to 1. Now, here is a perfect example of why I think it's necessary to separate fact, observation, from theory. Stephen Jay Gould has looked at this kind of thing and says, here you can see evolution occurring, therefore evolution is a fact since you can observe it. I'm saying, no, you've got to get rid of that sloppy thinking. You observe this form and this form and this form, and because you can see similarities between them, you would say, if natural selection occurred, then you would predict that indeed this would be the sequence you would find. It would be very close to disproving the whole theory if one of these was found down here beside this. In other words, you can falsify the theory of natural selection. There are certain findings, if they occurred, would not meet your expectations, and therefore in the classic Popperian statement, this is a potentially falsifiable hypothesis, and here is the kind of thing that could falsify it. We've got to keep that in mind. I am still waiting to find in the creation literature, and maybe tonight I'll hear it from my respected opponent here, will he give us a statement which, if it occurs, would falsify creationism? We can give you many that could falsify evolution. The point is we have not found them. Now let me go a bit further. This is just one series that we infer from our observations. If we look at the whole record of horse evolution, the whole thing gets put together like this, where we have that small, tiny one, about the size of a terrier, that was a browser, and through time, each one of these differently marked areas represents evidence for a different species of animal, horse, in this sequence. Now here is where I think we get a prediction that gives the creationists a hard time. Again, of course, I wait to be corrected. But for the moment, I stick my neck out. Here we have a single form, and in time it has diverged. All of these can be represented by fossils such as those that I've just shown you. A creationist looking at this, and according to the creationism that I've read from the books of Duane Gish and Henry Morris, who are respectively the senior officers in the Institution of Creation Research, which has sent Professor Lumsden to be with us, they have claimed that creation was the appearance of all kinds essentially simultaneously. And when that active creation was done, all the kinds of living things that have ever been on this earth are now on this earth, or were at some time in the past, because they admit there has been extinction. They realize we don't have dinosaurs crawling around here up and down the Connecticut River anymore. But there was good evidence to think there were dinosaurs. So extinction occurs. But notice the consequence of that is that initially there must have been significantly more kinds, more species than there are now. New ones are not created. The ones that were created, some are dying out. The creationist would have had to say this, that initially these were all that were created, and in time maybe a few have lived the modern horses. The evolutionists say, no, you can start from one form and it can diverge, and this is macroevolution. This is not variation within a species. This is the creation of many different species. In terms of their visible differences, the differences between them are those that can be recognized as representing different kinds. So here I think if we do have some sort of prediction, the predictions are consistent with evolutionary theory, and I don't see how that they can be explained by the notions of creationism. I'll turn to one more example. This is human evolution, a very touchy one, but a very important one. The black in these three figures to my left, now that I turn around, your left, the darkness there represents bones that we have found, fossil bones that we have found. As the legend here says, the skulls should also be darkened in, but were not darkened in so that you would not have obscured the detail that you see there. I'm admitting, we have to admit, that we have not found complete skeletons. We are finding more and more all the time, and these are becoming more and more complete all the time. But at the present, we have this kind of thing. Of course, this is a modern human. This could be all black. It's us. But what I'm saying is, we take this kind of information, and from that, we reconstruct various forms. The first two forms on the left of the previous figure I gave you are these Australopithecines. This, we think, is a different genus from Homo, which we see down here. And here's Homo sapiens, now not fully clothed, of course, but muscle and skin put on top of the bones we just saw. Notice the time. We have every reason to think that these are around 3.5, 3.8 million years old. The horses go back 60, 70, 80 million years. Again, how old are the oldest ones in creationism? That is a debate that is going on, but there are ample records in Duane Gish's and Henry Morris's writing that creation is only about 10,000 years old. That simply doesn't jibe with the dating we have done here. The last time we had a creationist here, Luther Sunderland, he was asked about this problem of dating, and he cited 20, 30-year-old evidence that carbon dating was a mess, it was inconsistent, you really couldn't believe it. And he said, well, why don't you cite the recent work of the past few years? He ignored that. And what about argon-potassium dating? He ignored that. What about the uranium dating and the formation of lead? He ignored that. He simply did not touch on information that was clearly contradictory to the notion of creation some 10,000 years ago. I wait to be enlightened in the present status of that idea with Professor Lumsden. But here we have, again, diversity. And if the creationists are right, these should all have been created at the same time, with these now becoming extinct and only this one surviving. Yes, we've had that, but they should all have been, that should have all have happened at one time, not stretched over the space of time here. Now, there's simply not time to repeat this story over and over again. I've only chosen two of these. Very early on, at the end of the last century, the biologist Ernst Haeckel said, you can take all living things, and in terms of the similarities and degrees of difference you see between them, you can recreate their common ancestry, and you will have indeed a branching tree, a phylogeny, a dendrogram of what happened in plant evolution, what happened in animal evolution, and what happened in the one-celled organisms. This, of course, has been enormously refined coming up to the present time. I can just show you a series of these to indicate the kind of situation that we are faced with. And I'm going to limit these to the organisms with backbones. We start down here in the Devonian, right above my finger, the Devonian. This is around 400 million years ago on the basis of very reliable dating with radioactive isotopes. And we can see in the fishes, there was one line giving rise to cartilaginous fishes, and today we have the sharks, the skates, the chimeras. Then there were the bony fishes coming up here, and this includes a very tiny sample of some 7,000 species or so of described fishes. There were the lobed-fin fishes coming off here. These are the ones that give evidence of limbs evolving into structures that would be useful on land. With the lobe-finned fishes, we have these coming up here, and here's Latimeria that we'd only known from the fossil record, but sure enough we found swimming around in the Indian Ocean, and we've got maybe 24 of these known today. But then from them, there arose the amphibians, those that made a business of getting a lot of their living from the land. As you went on with them, there was this magnificent burst of reptilian evolution. And in the Cretaceous, the Triassic, and the Jurassic in here, this was the golden age of dinosaurs. From them we have some of the turtles, we have and tortoises, and up here we have lizards, crocodiles, and the snakes should also be up there. There wasn't room to put them all. The great lizards of the past were in here, became extinct, and then there are two lines. One line giving rise to birds here, and there's tiny Archaeopteryx, of which I showed you an earlier, better example, a clearer example, and over here was a line giving rise to the mammals. Leaving out the birds, looking at the mammals, there was an enormous radiation and diversification, starting in the Cretaceous, leading up through the early Tertiary, and coming down here to the more recent forms. And all these diversities, we think, arose from a basic insectivorous form that was a permanent land dweller and indeed was warm-blooded, carried fur. There were among those animals that reverted to the sea, as we see here in the sirenians, the dugongs, the manatees, and of course the cetaceans, the dolphins, and the whales. Some were flying in the Chiroptera here, and there were, of course, our friends, the rodents there. And there's the line up here to the primates, and coming off of them was the evolution that I just showed you in terms of human evolution. There is then an enormous amount of information allowing us to put together these evolutionary sequences. And in all of them, the sequences are proceeding essentially step by step. We may hear that there are no true transitional forms in here. It's very hard, and as I've read some of the debates between creationists and evolutionists, the two have gone right by each other. The evolutionist is saying, look, Archaeopteryx is a transitional form. Simora is a transitional form, etc., etc. And the creationist is saying, no, that's not what you really mean by transitional. If it were transitional, you would what? Have more transitions on either side of it? How can you say Archaeopteryx is transitional to a bird? It's already a bird. It's got feathers. Yes, but it also has teeth, and it also has those claws on its wings. There are features there. Indeed, the first Archaeopteryx skeletons were found did not have any feathers around them, and they were classified as a small dinosaur, as a small reptile. And it was only later, when the more perfect specimens became known, that we realized feathers were associated with them, that we then moved them up to the transitional position that we put them in today. We have then this enormous diversity and variety of living things.